They said his holiday lights were a disruption, slapping him with fines and threats to tear down his beloved Christmas display. Jack Benson, a devoted family man and veteran, had brought joy to his neighborhood every December with a dazzling show of cheer. But this year, Mary Wilson, the HOA president, declared war on his traditions. She called his display an eyesore and accused him of breaking rules she had rewritten in secret. Mary, smug in her authority, believed Jack would crumble under her iron grip. What Mary didn't realize was that Jack wasn't the kind of man to back down. With every fine she issued, every threat she delivered, she unknowingly pushed him closer to uncovering her abuse of power. And when the truth finally came to light, it wasn't Jack's Christmas spirit that shattered. It was Mary's ironclad reputation. What happened next shocked the entire community. But let's start from the beginning. Jack Benson's favorite time of year was Christmas. For as long as he could remember, December had been a month of joy, togetherness, and light. Every year he went all out decorating his house, transforming it into a dazzling winter wonderland. Strings of multicolored lights wrapped around the eaves. Twinkling reindeer figurines stood proudly on the front lawn, and an illuminated nativity scene sat in the center of it all. A massive, glowing star, perched atop his roof, was the crowning touch, a beacon of holiday cheer that could be seen from blocks away. For Jack, the lights weren't just decorations. They were a way to spread happiness and create magical memories for his family and neighbors. Jack's display was so beloved that families from around the neighborhood would stop by to admire it. Kids would press their faces against the windows of passing cars, pointing excitedly as their parents slowed down to take in the spectacle. For Jack, those smiles made every hour spent untangling wires and climbing ladders worth it. He even dressed up as Santa a few times, handing out candy canes to wide-eyed children. But this year the tradition was in jeopardy. It all started one chilly morning in early December. Jack was sipping coffee in his kitchen, the aroma mixing with the faint scent of pine from the freshly decorated Christmas tree. The laughter of his two kids echoed from the living room, where they were trying to decide where to hang their stockings. Life felt perfect, until the mail arrived. Among the usual stack of holiday catalogs and bills was a stark white envelope with the HOA logo stamped prominently on the front. Jack's brow furrowed as he opened it. His heart sank as he read the contents. "Dear Mr. Benson," it began, "it has come to our attention that your holiday light display violates the newly established HOA guidelines regarding exterior decorations. Specifically, the display exceeds the allowable brightness and disrupts the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. You are required to remove the lights within 7 days to avoid further action, including fines." Jack couldn't believe what he was reading. "Exceeds the allowable brightness," he muttered to himself. "Disrupts aesthetic harmony." The phrases felt absurd. He reread the letter, hoping he had misunderstood, but the words were as clear as day. The HOA was banning his Christmas display. Jack's hands tightened around the paper, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "They've got to be kidding," he said aloud, his voice carrying into the living room. His wife, Lisa, appeared in the doorway, concern etched on her face. "What's wrong?" she asked. He handed her the letter. As she read it, her eyes widened. "They're really banning the lights?" she said, incredulous. "Why now? They've never had a problem before." Jack shrugged, though his jaw was clenched. "Apparently, there are new guidelines. I didn't even know they were voting on this." Lisa sighed, handing the letter back. "It's Mary Wilson, isn't it? She's been itching to control everything since she became president." Mary Wilson had been elected as the HOA president earlier that year, and her reign had been anything but smooth. She had a reputation for being overly strict, enforcing rules with an almost militant zeal. Jack had clashed with her once before over a small garden shed he'd built in his backyard, which she claimed was an eyesore, despite its perfect compliance with HOA regulations. This new restriction on holiday lights had her fingerprints all over it. Determined to get answers, Jack decided to attend the upcoming HOA meeting. When the day arrived, he walked into the meeting room with a mix of hope and defiance. The space was sterile, with fluorescent lighting and rows of uncomfortable plastic chairs. Mary Wilson sat at the head of the table, flanked by the other board members. Her expression was as unwelcoming as the room itself. "Mr. Benson," Mary began, her voice icy, "I assume you're here about the notice regarding your holiday lights." Jack took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. "That's right. I'd like to understand why my display is being targeted. For years, it's been a tradition that people in this neighborhood enjoy." Mary's lips pressed into a thin line. "This isn't about enjoyment, Mr. Benson. It's about maintaining the community's standards. Excessive displays disrupt the visual harmony of the neighborhood and could lead to complaints." Jack couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Complaints?" he said, his voice rising slightly. "From who? Every year, people tell me how much they love the lights. Families bring their kids to see them." Mary raised a hand, cutting him off. "Regardless of personal opinions, the guidelines were updated to reflect what's best for the community as a whole, and your display does not comply." Jack glanced around the room, hoping for support from his neighbors. Some avoided his gaze, while others looked uncomfortable but said nothing. He saw a few sympathetic faces, but no one spoke up. The silence stung. "So that's it?" Jack asked, his frustration boiling over. "No discussion, no compromise, just a blanket ban?" Mary's expression didn't waver. "The rules are the rules, Mr. Benson. If you refuse to comply, there will be consequences." Jack left the meeting feeling defeated, but not beaten. As he walked to his car, he clenched his fists, his mind racing with thoughts. Mary might think she could silence him with her bureaucratic red tape, but Jack wasn't the type to roll over. If she wanted a fight, she was going to get one. Jack thought the worst of the conflict was over after the initial letter and HOA meeting. He figured Mary Wilson had made her point, and perhaps he could negotiate a compromise. But he soon realized that Mary wasn't interested in compromise. She was interested in total control. The next morning, Jack found another letter from the HOA waiting on his doorstep. This one was even more aggressive than the first. It accused him of additional violations, including improper wiring, noise disturbances, and obstructing community walkways. The notice came with a new threat: $100 in fines per day until the decorations were removed. Jack felt a mix of disbelief and anger. Improper wiring. His lights were professionally installed and inspected. Noise disturbances? The lights didn't even play music. Obstructing walkways? His yard wasn't anywhere near the sidewalk. It was clear these claims were fabricated, designed to intimidate him into compliance. Lisa, seeing his frustration, tried to reassure him. "They're just trying to scare you," she said. "They're hoping you'll give up." Jack nodded, though his jaw remained clenched. Well, it's not going to work. But the pressure from the HOA was relentless. Within days, Jack's house became a battleground. Bright orange violation notices began appearing on his front door almost daily. Mary even went so far as to send HOA representatives to take photographs of his yard, a blatant attempt to document his so-called violations. The sight of the strangers walking across his lawn with clipboards infuriated him. "What do they think this is? A crime scene?" Jack muttered as he pulled down yet another notice from his door. The strain started to affect his family. His kids, usually so excited for the holidays, began to notice the tension. "Dad, are we in trouble?" his youngest asked one evening, her voice tinged with worry. Jack knelt down, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "No, sweetheart, we're not in trouble. We're just dealing with some people who don't like Christmas as much as we do." Lisa, too, felt the weight of the conflict. "Jack, this is getting out of hand," she said one night as they sat together in the living room. "I know you want to fight this, but what if it gets worse? What if they try to take legal action?" Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know it's a lot, but if we back down now, they'll think they can do this to anyone. It's not just about the lights, it's about standing up to them." Lisa nodded, though her worry lingered. "Just promise me you'll be careful." Despite the mounting pressure, Jack refused to back down. He decided to reach out to his neighbors, hoping to rally support. He knocked on doors, spoke to families, and explained the situation. Many sympathized with him, agreeing that Mary's actions were unfair. Some even shared their own frustrations with the HOA, recounting stories of arbitrary fines and excessive rules. But when Jack asked them to speak up, most hesitated. "I just don't want to get involved," one neighbor said apologetically. "Mary can make life miserable if you're on her bad side." Others were more direct. "I'm with you, Jack," said another, "but I've got enough on my plate without taking on the HOA." It was clear that fear of retaliation kept most people silent. Jack couldn't blame them, but it was disheartening to realize how deeply Mary's influence had spread. With little support from his neighbors, Jack decided to bring in reinforcements. He contacted Rachel Miller, a local attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. Rachel, a sharp and no-nonsense woman, listened intently as Jack explained the situation. She leafed through the stack of letters and violations he'd collected, her expression growing more incredulous with each one. "This is blatant overreach," she said finally, setting the papers down. "They're targeting you, plain and simple. HOA rules can't override your basic property rights, and these so-called violations are flimsy at best." Rachel's confidence bolstered Jack's resolve. She advised him to start gathering evidence: photos of his decorations, copies of the HOA notices, and any communication with neighbors who supported him. "The more documentation we have, the stronger our case will be," she said. Jack threw himself into the task, meticulously photographing every detail of his display and saving every HOA notice he received. He even began recording his interactions with HOA representatives, capturing their evasive answers and condescending tones. With Rachel's guidance, he filed a formal complaint challenging the HOA's actions. But Mary wasn't done yet. Just days after Jack's complaint was filed, she escalated her tactics. One morning, Jack stepped outside to find a massive orange sign staked into his front lawn. In bold letters it read, "Violation, non-compliance with HOA regulations." It was a public shaming tactic, designed to humiliate him in front of his neighbors. Jack's blood boiled as he yanked the sign out of the ground. His kids, watching from the window, looked worried. "What does it mean, Dad?" his oldest asked. Jack took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "It means they're trying to scare us, but we're not going to let them." As the conflict escalated, Jack began to realize that this wasn't just about holiday lights anymore. It was about standing up to a system that thrived on intimidation and control. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to see it through. Mary Wilson might have started this fight, but Jack wasn't about to let her finish it. By now, the holiday season in Jack's neighborhood wasn't filled with the usual cheer and warmth. Instead, it felt like a war zone, and his house was the battlefield. Every morning brought a new violation notice. Every evening brought new whispers from the neighbors. Jack was standing his ground, but the pressure was taking its toll. Still, he knew he couldn't back down. Mary Wilson was relentless in her campaign. Her latest move was a letter threatening legal action if Jack didn't dismantle his display within 72 hours. The letter was riddled with exaggerated claims. His lights were a public safety hazard. His decorations were disturbing the peace, and his refusal to comply was causing unrest among neighbors. Jack could almost hear Mary's smug tone as he read it, and it only fueled his determination to fight harder. But Jack wasn't alone anymore. After hiring Rachel Miller, the lawyer specializing in HOA disputes, he finally felt like he had someone in his corner. Rachel was fierce, sharp-witted, and completely unimpressed by Mary's antics. She dove into the HOA's rules and regulations with a fine-tooth comb, quickly uncovering inconsistencies and oversteps. "This woman thinks she's a dictator," Rachel said one afternoon as she flipped through the latest batch of letters from the HOA. "But she's built her castle on sand. We just need to expose it." Rachel's confidence was contagious, and Jack felt a renewed sense of purpose. Together, they began building a case against the HOA. Rachel advised Jack to document everything: photos of his decorations, timestamps of when he received notices, and even recordings of his conversations with Mary and other HOA representatives. "The more evidence we have, the stronger our case will be," she explained. Jack threw himself into the task. He meticulously photographed every string of lights, every reindeer figurine, and every element of his display, proving that everything was safely installed and well-maintained. He saved copies of every notice and email from the HOA, carefully organizing them into a growing file. He even started recording his interactions with neighbors, many of whom admitted they loved his display but were too scared to speak out publicly. At the same time, Jack decided to take the fight to a broader audience. He posted about his experience on a local community forum, detailing the HOA's heavy-handed tactics and the joy his lights brought to the neighborhood. His post quickly gained traction, with dozens of neighbors and even people from outside the community commenting in support. Many shared their own stories of dealing with overzealous HOAs, turning Jack's post into a rallying point. But the real breakthrough came when Jack's story caught the attention of a local news station. A reporter reached out, asking if they could cover the dispute. Jack hesitated at first. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, but Rachel encouraged him. "The more public this gets, the harder it'll be for Mary to keep hiding behind her rules," she said. The reporter arrived on a crisp December afternoon, her camera crew setting up in front of Jack's house. The lights were in full display, twinkling against the early evening sky. Jack stood on his porch, nervous but determined. "Why are these decorations so important to you?" the reporter asked, holding the microphone steady. Jack took a deep breath. "Because Christmas is about more than just lights and decorations. It's about bringing people together, about joy and hope. For years, this display has been something the whole neighborhood enjoys. It's a tradition that brings smiles to kids' faces and reminds us what the holidays are all about. No one has the right to take that away." The segment aired later that evening, and it created an immediate buzz. People from all over the city started reaching out, offering words of encouragement and sharing their own frustrations with HOAs. Some even showed up at Jack's house, dropping off cookies or just stopping by to admire the lights. The increased attention didn't sit well with Mary. In an effort to regain control, she doubled down on her narrative, giving her own interview to the local news station. "This isn't about ruining Christmas," she claimed, her expression stern. "This is about ensuring the safety and harmony of our community. Excessive decorations like Mr. Benson's pose both a safety hazard and a disruption to our neighborhood's aesthetic. But Mary's attempt to sway public opinion backfired spectacularly. As the reporter pressed her for details, it became clear that her claims were unfounded. The safety hazards she mentioned were vague at best, and her insistence on aesthetic harmony seemed hypocritical when viewers noticed her own house in the background, lavishly decorated with expensive lights and oversized ornaments. Meanwhile, Rachel continued to dig deeper into the HOA's operations. She uncovered emails between Mary and other board members that revealed a troubling pattern. Mary had been selectively enforcing rules, targeting homeowners she didn't like while turning a blind eye to violations from her friends. One email even explicitly mentioned Jack's name, with Mary describing his display as an eyesore I'll deal with personally. Armed with this evidence, Rachel filed a formal legal complaint against the HOA, accusing them of harassment, discrimination, and overreach. The case was set to be heard in court on December 15th, just 10 days before Christmas. As the court date approached, the mood in the neighborhood began to shift. Inspired by Jack's determination and the public attention, more neighbors started speaking out. A group of parents organized a petition demanding that the HOA revoke the ban on holiday lights. Local businesses donated to a legal fund to help Jack cover his expenses. Even some of the HOA board members began distancing themselves from Mary, realizing that her actions were damaging their credibility. Through it all, Jack remained focused. He knew the fight wasn't just about him. It was about standing up to a system that thrived on intimidation and control. Mary had underestimated him, but she was about to learn a valuable lesson. Jack Benson wasn't the kind of man who gave up easily. By the time December 15th arrived, Jack's house was more than just a symbol of holiday cheer. It had become a symbol of resistance, a shining reminder that standing up for what's right can inspire an entire community. The stage was set for a showdown, and Jack was ready to see it through to the end. The courtroom was filled with a tense energy on the morning of December 15th. Jack arrived early, dressed in his best suit, a stark contrast to his usual flannel shirts and jeans. His wife, Lisa, stood by his side, her reassuring hand on his arm. They were surrounded by a handful of neighbors who had come to show their support, their quiet presence a reminder that Jack wasn't fighting this battle alone. At the front of the room sat the judge, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and an air of authority. Mary Wilson entered soon after, flanked by her legal counsel. She exuded her usual confidence, but there was a nervous edge to her demeanor, a tightness in her jaw that betrayed her discomfort. She was facing a public reckoning, and for once, she wasn't the one holding all the cards. Rachel Miller was in her element. She began by presenting the case against the HOA with precision and clarity, outlining the ways in which Mary had overstepped her authority. Her opening statement was sharp and direct, immediately capturing the judge's attention. "This case is not about a simple dispute over holiday lights," Rachel began, her voice steady and firm. "It's about an abuse of power by an HOA that has chosen to target one homeowner unfairly, while ignoring its own rules and responsibilities. The evidence will show that this is not about community harmony, but about personal vendettas and overreach." The judge nodded slightly, indicating he was following her argument. Rachel wasted no time presenting her evidence. She showed photos of Jack's decorations, pointing out how they were safely installed and adhered to all electrical and zoning regulations. She presented the violation notices, highlighting their vague and exaggerated claims. Then came the emails, the damning pieces of evidence that revealed Mary's true intentions. One email in particular caught everyone's attention. In it, Mary had written to another board member, "We need to shut this down before he thinks he can get away with it. Benson's lights are ridiculous, and I won't let them make a mockery of our neighborhood." Rachel paused after reading the email aloud, letting the words sink in. "This is not the language of a fair and impartial HOA president," she said. "This is the language of someone using their position to settle personal grudges." Mary's lawyer attempted to counter, arguing that the HOA's actions were justified under their rules. But when pressed for specifics, their argument began to crumble. The rules Mary claimed to enforce were vague at best and had been applied inconsistently. Rachel pounced on these inconsistencies, using them to paint a clear picture of selective enforcement. When it was Jack's turn to speak, he rose from his seat, his hands clasped in front of him. He wasn't a lawyer, but his words carried the weight of personal conviction. "For years, I've put up these decorations to bring joy to my family, my neighbors, and anyone who passes by," he began, his voice steady but emotional. "This isn't just about lights. It's about the spirit of Christmas, about community and tradition. I've tried to work with the HOA to find a solution, but every attempt has been met with hostility. I'm here today because I believe in standing up for what's right, even when it's not easy." As Jack spoke, he noticed the judge leaning forward slightly, clearly engaged. He also saw some of his neighbors nodding along, their expressions a mix of pride and encouragement. It gave him the strength to finish strong. "I'm not asking for special treatment," he said. "I'm asking for fairness, for respect, for the chance to bring a little light into the world without being punished for it." Mary's turn to testify was far less convincing. She repeated the same arguments she'd made to the press, claiming that the lights were a safety hazard and disrupted the neighborhood's aesthetics. But when pressed for concrete examples or complaints from other neighbors, she faltered. Rachel's cross-examination was brutal, exposing the lack of evidence and the personal bias driving Mary's actions. "Isn't it true," Rachel asked, "that your own home features decorations that far exceed the HOA's guidelines?" Mary hesitated, her face flushing. "My decorations are tasteful and in line with the community's standards," she said weakly. "And yet you singled out Mr. Benson's display, which, by all accounts, has been a beloved tradition in this neighborhood for years," Rachel countered. "Why is that?" Mary had no answer. The judge adjourned the court for a short recess, and the room buzzed with quiet speculation. Jack felt a mix of hope and nervous energy as he sat with Lisa, who squeezed his hand tightly. "You've done everything you could," she whispered. "No matter what happens, I'm proud of you." When the judge returned, the room fell silent. His decision was clear and decisive. "The evidence presented today demonstrates a pattern of selective enforcement and personal bias on the part of the HOA and its president, Mary Wilson," he began. "This court finds the actions of the HOA to be unjustified and in violation of the rights of the homeowner, Mr. Benson. The ban on holiday lights is hereby revoked, and the HOA is ordered to cover all legal fees incurred by the plaintiff. Furthermore, I strongly recommend that the HOA review its governance practices to prevent future instances of misconduct." The room erupted in quiet murmurs of approval. Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him, the tension of the past weeks finally breaking. He turned to Rachel, who gave him a triumphant smile. "We did it," she said simply. But the story didn't end there. That evening, word of the victory spread quickly through the neighborhood. Neighbors who had been hesitant to speak out before now came forward, offering congratulations and sharing their own grievances with the HOA. By the next night, Jack's yard was transformed into a celebration. Neighbors gathered with hot cocoa and cookies, bringing their own decorations to add to the display. Strings of lights, ornaments, and even an inflatable Santa appeared as people worked together to make Jack's house shine brighter than ever. Jack stood on his porch, watching as his kids laughed and played with the other children, their faces glowing with happiness. Lisa stood beside him, her arm around his waist. "You did it, Jack," she said softly. "You stood up for all of us." Mary Wilson resigned from her position as HOA president within weeks of the ruling, her reputation irreparably damaged. A new board was elected, one that promised transparency and fairness. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a true community again. As Jack looked out at the sea of lights and smiling faces, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. His fight had been about more than just holiday decorations. It had been about protecting the things that mattered most: tradition, community, and the simple joys that bring people together. And in the end, he had won.